The class is called the Science of Spirituality, and I'm going to share some slides with you to kind of help us as we move along. And so you should be seeing my slides. Is everybody able to see those? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody that the slides are good? All right, thank you. Appreciate that. So this really is an interesting topic that I just recently had the opportunity to be engaged in. Had an opportunity several months ago to attend a seminar back in Washington, D.C., led by Dr. Lisa Miller from Columbia University. Dr. Miller has also written a book called The Spiritual Child, which I will recommend to you as a reading, as further reading if you're interested in the topic. What was fascinating to me was that obviously being a good Army TDY training seminar, I read her book in advance of going there, and then they sent me probably 500, 600 pages of research documents that I had to read through. I will not make you read through all of those documents, but needless to say, there is a large volume of information on the topic that we're going to look at this morning. So we titled this class, The Science of Spirituality and Wellness. And again, what we're going to be looking at is a new set of findings and information that are coming out after a 20-year research project that basically scientifically show a linkage to spirituality and protective qualities. So that's kind of where we're going. Here's our agenda for the day. We're going to do, I'm going to do a quick overview. As you can imagine, there is a plethora of information in this area. So I am not a scientist. I am a humble, lowly chaplain, and I'm going to do my best to lay out some of the information for you. But this is going to be an overview at best. Now, I will tell you, currently, God willing, we have Dr. Miller scheduled to come here to JBLM to do a seminar for us 1 through 3 June. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, please continue to stay up with us, and we will be able to bring Dr. Miller here to share with us in the coming months. So more to follow if you're interested in this topic. So really want to just kind of look down through the things that are on the agenda here. I'm going to give you a quick overview. In fact, I'll show you a little video of Dr. Miller kind of talking through some of the high points of what we're going to talk about. Then I'll spend just a few minutes talking about the research. I found how they did the research just absolutely fascinating. So I want to share with you for a little bit about the multifaceted approach that they took to the research here. Probably the two payoff topics for us in the military are the protective qualities that they discovered, that spiritual life produces some protective qualities. And that's a very compelling element of the research that has been shown. How does that apply to the military? And especially here at JBLM, we'll look at that for just a minute. And then I'll close out by what I think are some takeaways, and then I'll open it up to you for questions. So that's kind of where we're going this morning. And I hope as we go along, this will generate a lot of questions and that we can have good discussion at the end. But let me start off by showing you just a little video that we put together of Dr. Miller, kind of explaining a little bit of what this is all about. Can you see the video?
I'm Dr. Lisa Miller. I'm a clinical scientist and psychologist For 20 years, I've been a professor at Columbia University, where I founded the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute. This book, The Spiritual Child, is a synthesis of 20 years of science from both my lab and fellow labs around the country that in aggregate shows that spirituality is the most important protective factor against suffering, the most essential factor for thriving relationships and long-term meaning in children. In fact, the deep spiritual core is essential to a thriving and flourishing child. And in this book, the science on the pathway for parents, for grandparents, to support natural spirituality in their children is shown both through narratives, stories, and a rich body of published peer-reviewed research. Parents and grandparents are really the most essential contributors to the formation of spirituality in children. Twin studies show that every single child is born with the innate capacity for spiritual life. We are naturally spiritual beings alongside being inherently physical, emotional, and moral beings. But spirituality is something that, despite its heritable roots, must be nourished. It needs sunshine and air and water to flourish. And parents and grandparents are the ones who see the child's natural spirituality, who nourish the child's natural spirituality and see it to fruition. There is no love in the world like the love of the grandparents. And as we've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of young people, time and time again I hear, my grandparents, they just love me. I sit at their kitchen table and they listen to me. No one ever listens to me. So now, when I think of God, it's kind of God and my grandparents all rolled up into one. And that is because the deep love of a grandparent and the deep love of a parent has much in common, has much in common with the way that we feel a love towards our higher power, God, Hashem, Allah, whatever our word may be. In the making of a spiritual child, there's actually an equal contribution of a parent or grandparents sharing of their own spiritual life, transparency and openness through which they pray, meditate, read sacred texts, and equally, the parent or grandparents live unconditional love. It is really the embodiment of spiritual life through the parent or grandparent. Our values coming and going, our giving to fellow people, service, homeless shelters, the environment. The child is watching it every minute. And so it is equally the embodiment of spiritual life through us as parents and grandparents and our own open and free expression of spiritual life that the child witnesses at every moment of the day that creates the spiritual child. The scientific method is enormously valuable in understanding the likelihood of healing, the likelihood of recovery. And science can do a great deal to say, for instance, those with a strong spiritual life are 80% less likely to become depressed. Those who are addicted are more likely to recover through a deepening of spiritual awareness. Science is a roadmap that writ large applies to all of us. Through the process of spiritual life, whether it's prayer or meditation or right action, science cannot predict for whom or at what moment spiritual awareness will set fire. Science cannot explain how and why we are touched and have a radical reshuffling of meaning through spiritual life. Science can bring us to the edge, but it cannot explain the power of spirituality per se. Science can bring us to the edge of our psychological possibility for spiritual life, but it cannot explain the extraordinary power of spirit, creator, or spirituality per se.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that little quick introduction from Dr. Miller herself. As she mentioned as she was going through there, and what we want to focus on for a little bit, a couple of moments today, is just the idea that she mentioned it about research and science. How research and science are able to provide a lens to look at a topic, and in looking at that topic, then be able to draw some facts and some data and different types of things that will hopefully help us or drive us to some conclusions. So I was absolutely fascinated while I was at the seminar and as I read the book, absolutely fascinated by some of the research and the research techniques that were used in this. So again, this is your garrison chaplain trying to walk you through scientific stuff. So please be gentle with me. I'm going to try to do the best I can to explain some of this really deep stuff. The first thing that struck me was really stuff that we're probably, when we talk about research and science and data, stuff that most of us are a little more familiar with. A big part of what Dr. Miller and her team and teams all across the country and the world have done in this area is basically look at use things like data studies, interviews, tracking people. You heard her mention in that thing about twin studies, all kinds of different study techniques that we're probably more familiar with were used to come up with a variety of different data sets about spirituality. And most of these data sets were looking at different issues or problems and comparing what happened to folks who either had a strong spiritual life or folks who did not have a spiritual life, and then comparing the two. Was there a corollary between how behaviors or activities that were happening to those people were affected by whether they were involved in spiritual activity or not? And as you know, I just threw one chart up here on the board, and I didn't really want to even talk about the chart per se, but just to show you there are pages and pages and pages and pages of comparative studies that talk about how spirituality improves or helps people not become involved in negative behaviors. Okay, so that was one element of the research, was just the plain old go out and do surveys, go out and do interviews, tracking family members and people and twin studies over a longitudinal study. Most of her longitudinal studies now are up into the 20-year range. So that was one element to it. Another element was the element of brain scans. Again, I found this completely fascinating. What they do, and this is a fairly standard practice that has been around a while as well, but they would bring folks in, hook them up to the tabs that measure different areas of your brain, and then walk them through different survey questions and interview questions and imagery that would show them what portions of your brain are the most active when you are on a certain topic or a certain subject. How this played out in several of one of the studies that they did was, again, just incredibly fascinating to me, was they would ask people in a pre-survey to describe 3 of their most spiritual events in their life. And they would then pick images that went along with those events, and they would write a little narrative about those 3 events. Then the researchers would take that and they would build it into a presentation. In the meantime, they would ask a series of standard questions to the person to get a baseline of what areas of their brain were firing during normal questions about normal subjects. Then they would take the presentation that they had developed using the pictures and the stories that the person themselves had provided about spirituality and their own personal spiritual life, and they would put that presentation in front of them. Then they would watch what areas of the brain would fire and how much firing there was, and through that began to be able to show how the brain actually processes spiritual material, where it processes it, how it processes it, what it does to the brain. In fact, one of the really fascinating areas and studies in this one was that the brain, your brain when you're in your spiritual mode, actually resonates at the same wavelength as someone doing meditation, and it's the same wavelength that that is at the Earth's crust. It's the wavelength of the Earth, and so it was an interesting. This was an interesting addition to the data studies, in the sense that now we were kind of marrying some information that we were gathering by surveys and interviews and data gathering with what's actually going on in the brain as people are processing things spiritually. You also may have heard a comment in there that Dr. Miller made that's really kind of foundational, and it's really a big thought if you think about it, is that everybody has a spiritual element to their life. Everybody. Spirituality is not something that one group has and another group doesn't. That everybody comes from the factory with a ability to be spiritual. Her studies have shown that across cultural spectrums, across countries, across different faith groups, everybody comes from the factory with the ability to be spiritual. Now, you also heard her say that spirituality is one of those innate qualities that if it's not nurtured or if it's ignored, can to some degree go dormant. But it's not that you don't have it. Everybody has the ability to have a spiritual life, to connect with the transcendent in some way, shape, or form. And I have to admit, I've always found it fascinating. When I was in college, I looked at this in a couple of sociology classes and anthropology classes, that throughout recorded history of mankind, there has never been a society that has been discovered on the remotest part of the planet that didn't have some kind of spiritual or religious practice or spiritual or religious system. It just is hardwired in us. So Dr. Miller and her team are trying to help us kind of get a handle on how that works, where that works, and what are the benefits of it. So the last piece of research that they were doing, which is relatively new, is the idea of brain imagery. Again, fascinating work in this area. Many of you have probably, or you may have seen on TV lately, or if you're like me surfing through channels, I hit on a couple of documentaries about the new ideas of neuroplasticity, that how the brain can actually reshape itself, how you can use your own directed thinking to kind of restructure your own brain. And there's a lot of new research out showing that is a practice and a process that is been going on for years. That we just have not had the technology to actually see that when we're looking at somebody's brain. But now with brain imagery, we have that ability to see what areas of the brain are actually being physically affected by behavior, and what does that mean. And so this is kind of a new area, but it is, again, an area that as she walked us through it, is absolutely fascinating in this area of spirituality. And I'll just share one little story in that area that I thought was interesting. It's actually the slide that's on the screen with the little brain images. What this study looked at, and again, this was only one study amongst many studies, but this study specifically looked at the area of the brain that is associated with depression. And what they did is they tracked people who had major depressive disorder, and they tracked them and did scans on them like you see on the screen over at regular intervals, 6-month intervals over a period of time. They then compared that to what a normal person's brain looks like and did some measurements. And one of the interesting things that they discovered in that initial research was that people who have major depressive disorder have a thinning of the cortex in the area that you see in red on the little diagram there. So that area of the brain actually gets smaller in depressive people. And what she said to us is, think of your brain, think of your the cortex as processing power in a computer. So those areas of the brain actually are shrinking in people who have major depressive disorder. What they then did is took a group of people who were willing to sign up for their study and began to ask them to pick up some kind of spiritual practice. If they were willing to enter the study, then they didn't tell them what type of spiritual practice, they just asked them to begin to pick up a spiritual practice. Now, at the same time, they had already taken scans of people who are actively involved in spiritual practices, spiritual life. So what you were able to see is a brain of a person who has major depressive disorder, very thin in the cortex, the brain of a person who is normal, which has a normal sized cortex. When they studied the brains of people who are actively involved in spiritual activity, spiritual life, and practicing a religious faith, being part of a faith group, that portion of the spiritual person's cortex was larger. It was larger than the normal person, and it was much larger than the thin cortex in the depressed person. So what they then did is took this group of people who had come in who had depressive disorder, asked them to get involved in spiritual activities and to try to develop a spiritual life. And they tested them again over 6-month periods, taking these types of images of their brains as they went along. And lo and behold, over a period of time, the person who had the thin cortex from depression then moved to a more normal cortex size, and then eventually moved to the larger, more protective cortex size of the spiritual persons that they had used as a baseline in the early parts of the study. So they've done multiple studies with imagery and areas of the brain that affect different types of behaviors like depression. And so as spirituality becomes more a strength for that person, those portions of the brain begin to then actually grow. They actually build more processing power. It's absolutely fascinating. So when you marry the three things together, the old style just studies and research and questions and interviews with the brain scan stuff that they're doing with the areas of the brain and how they fire, when they fire, what spirituality does to that, and then this final area of looking at the actual physical brain and watching what happens to it as a person begins to develop a stronger spiritual life. All of that research is kind of fused together, or is fused together, in what Dr. Miller is covering, not only in the book, but also in the peer research that she mentioned before. And again, I'm going to give you a link at the end where you can actually go and read the study, the peer-reviewed study that I just mentioned on depression. It's in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and peer-reviewed, highly researched and scrutinized, and it's fascinating reading if you want it. So that's kind of the science and the research background. So now let me shift a little bit to okay, so what? Very interesting, Chaplain Schaffner. Who cares, right? But what's the point? So our brain gets bigger if we go to church. All right, good. Okay, what does that do for us? All right, so look, where I want to take you next is where Dr. Miller is focusing on in her work with the Army. Her work with the Army, we've been talking about protective qualities. So what are the kind of things that come out of having a stronger spiritual life? And again, this is all based on her research. 20 years of research. And the reason I'm setting you up, the reason I'm spending so much time to set you up for this slide is because the numbers I'm fixing to put on this screen, many of you are going to look at it and go, that can't be possible, okay? But this is actually based on the science and the research of spirituality and science and how the data, where the research leads. So what has been discovered by Dr. Miller and several other teams that have been looking into this is that if you are spiritually active, if you are part of a faith community, if you are involved in religious activity, and again, we're talking in the broad sense about spirituality, and Dr. Miller will tell you very clearly that her studies were not about one specific faith or one specific faith group. It was about spirituality, the broader subject, right? Now, how do most people express their spirituality? Most people express their spiritualities through some form of religion. And so whether it's church or synagogue or mosque or whatever the way they express it, that religious expression is a subset within the larger set of spirituality. So when she's talking about this research and she's talking about the data, she's not talking about one specific faith group, talking about the general topic of spirituality. If a person is spiritually active and is involved in spiritual practices and spiritual development, they are 60% less likely to get major depression. So you let that sink in for a minute. 60% protective quality against major depression. Now, all of us who are in any of the helping agencies or in leadership, you know what depression often leads to. Depression often leads to difficult and bad behaviors or difficult and bad outcomes especially for our younger soldiers or any of our soldiers. So depression is one of those elements. Think about right now with COVID, how much we've been talking about isolation and talking about what that's doing to people and talking about how that's leading to depression, not being able to go out and do your favorite things, not being able to go out to your favorite restaurant, not being able to take your family to X, Y, or Z. Those are leading to, or those are very difficult pieces and can add to people's depression. And so what Dr. Miller's research is telling us is one of the ways to combat depression is by getting people involved or encouraging people to be involved in spiritual activities. Now, in her book, which is more focused on children, she would also tell you that this is one of the reasons why, and she's unabashed about how she puts this in the book is that she's encouraging you to encourage the spiritual life of your children. Because if you start at a young age with children, you are setting them up for success in all of these areas. All of these protective qualities come to you or come to your children as they begin to develop their own spiritual strength and sense of purpose. So 60% protective against major depressive disorder. This is a staggering one for us here in the Army, right? 50 to 80% decrease in relative risk for suicide. 50 to 80%. Now, there were some surveys and studies that weren't done by Dr. Miller that were done in years past that were looking at just people who were practicing religious practice and suicide. And the numbers in those studies mirror these numbers. Those studies came up with a number of 62%. So a person who is involved in spiritual activity, who's developing a deep spiritual life, is 50 to 80%. Let's just use the number that I just used in the middle, 60 to 65%. Protective quality against suicide and suicidality. So as we look at soldiers and family members and talk about or think about getting our hands around spirituality or getting our hands around suicide, Dr. Miller will just tell you that the most protective thing you can do for a person, a child, a soldier, a young adult, is get them involved in some kind of religious activity, some kind of spiritual development. It is the most protective element that you can include in somebody's life to make them less likely to be involved in suicide. 80% protective against substance use and substance abuse, dependency and abuse. 80%. Now, the reason this one is so interesting to me is because as you think of the military, those of us, again, who are involved in any of the helping agencies or any of the responders, the hospital folks, you know what percentage of folks who come in for some kind of thing that alcohol or substance is linked to. So when we're talking about domestic violence, alcohol, huge contributor to domestic violence. When we're talking about, again, suicide or self-harm, huge amount of folks use alcohol or drugs and then take their lives. Homicides, other criminal activity, alcohol, drugs, very high corollary between those activities, those negative activities, and substance abuse. The protective quality of having spiritual or a strong spiritual or religious life is 80% protective in those areas of falling into dependency and abuse of substances. Okay, so the tertiary effects there are clear as well. If a person's not being involved in that, then they're probably not going to get involved in the laundry list of things that I just mentioned, or we at least take away one factor that lead to some of these other difficult issues that people get into. 70% protective against risk-taking. Now, when she first looked at this, she was looking at primarily at teenage girls and sexuality in their teens, and found that there was a 70% less likelihood of risky sexual activity in their teens if they had a strong spiritual or religious life. But then she broadened it out and began looking at other factors. And of course, for us in the military, we would be thinking about, soldiers who are, doing risk-taking behaviors as kind of an adrenaline rush, right? this research basically has shown that the protective quality there is about 70%. So 70% less likely to be involved in those kind of risk-taking behaviors if the person has a strong spiritual or religious life. So that's really the kind of the payoff slide of all of this research and all of this background. These are the kinds of things that Dr. Miller is encouraging us can come out of having a strong spiritual life, or that the data shows can lead to these types of qualities out of a strong spiritual or religious life. So I want to move to the next thing and looking at it from a point of view of application. How does this apply to us here at JBLM? How does it apply to service members in general? How does it apply to us here at JBLM? I've kind of alluded to that a little bit as I was walking through the protective qualities, but I really want to kind of focus in on really kind of two groups that I think are very clearly could benefit greatly from what this research is showing. This first little pie chart here is just the population of JBLM. I got this straight off of the briefing that the Garrison team gives to incoming people about the population of JBLM and who's here. So if we're thinking about two primary groups, the first group I want you to think about is families and children, right? And again, that's the thrust of the book Dr. Miller wrote, The Spiritual Child. All of the research all of the research is in the spiritual child. So it has obviously applications outside of childhood, but her focus originally was on how do we help our children grow up with these qualities so that they become more protected. Well, if you look at just looking at this chart, how many family members are here on JBLM? And then when you throw in the retiree family members, you're looking at a group of, of somewhere near 200,000 people, family members that are here on JBLM. So when we're talking about children and parents and helping parents kind of maybe re-examine or think about this type of activity for their kids, we can see that this is a population, a large population group that we have right here on our post or around our post that come onto our post. We got a lot of kiddos. I would say amen right there. Love kiddos. So we got a lot of kiddos. And those kids, if this research is as bona fide as it is, then it's almost criminal for us not to be involving our kiddos in some type of spiritual development to develop these protective qualities later on. The next group would be our soldiers, our service members, right? So a couple of charts just kind of showing you these were for 2019, but I look at these charts every year and they very rarely change. What the chart is basically showing you is that amongst our service members, we always are in a young population, right? I had the blessed privilege 2 months ago of turning 60. I am by far the oldest person in every group that I go to on this post because everybody is under 30, right? That's just the way it is. I used to joke that every year I would get a year older, but the soldiers were always 18 because that's the truth, right? We're always bringing in a new crop of recruits every year. And so the soldier age, the sailor, the Marine, the airman, they stay in that lower age range. That's the overwhelming majority of our formation, right? So just looking at this chart, you can see, and I'll tell you, this number hasn't changed much in 10 years, right? That the under 30 crowd for enlisted folks is 69% of our formation. 69% of our enlisted formation under the age of 30. Okay? Almost 50% of our officer formation is now under 30. So when you look at that on aggregate, our young population is still, in many of ways, in the formative years of their spiritual development. Dr. Miller, in the book, talks about a surge of interest in the transcendent and in the spiritual, in the religious, when a child reaches the teen years. That interest in spirituality almost always bleeds over into their mid-20s, even sometimes their late 20s. So that's the age group that are the majority of our formation. So her research is saying to us is that helping people in that age range develop their spiritual and religious lives will bring those protective qualities that we talked about on the previous slide. So for us here at JBLM, the application is very broad and it's large. We have lots of kiddos, lots of families, and we have lots of young people who are still in the formative years of their spiritual and religious development. If we will foster that for them, it will bring about the protective qualities that we saw on the previous slide. So two very key groups that would be affected by this. The last chart I'll throw up here for you is a chart. This is the religious breakdown of soldiers and airmen on JBLM. Now, this is based off of what people put on their dog tags. One of the reasons we like this chart is because what people put on their dog tags is a self-identification. It's not the chaplain telling them what to put on there. It's not their moms or their dads. When they go into the recruiting station and they get asked the question or they're filling out the form, it's what they identify themselves as. And so we love this chart because it constantly, it reaffirms to us where people see themselves, okay? A very interesting breakdown for us. One of the stories that you'll hear a lot in the media these days, probably the predominant story about these types of charts, is what's been called the rise of the nuns or the Nuns. That the category that is no religious preference or none, it has been rising, and it's rising more than any other category. That is absolutely true. It is the category that is rising the most. But oftentimes, what gets left out of that conversation is that, or that presentation is that, yes, that's maybe the fastest growing component of the study, but it in comparison to the rest of the wheel, it is an overwhelmingly small group, even though it is the fastest growing group, which brings some question and some alarm. It's still the smallest group, all right? So if you look at the chart, the wheel that I have next to you, and just add up the percentages, you'll find that 73% of the soldiers and airmen on JBLM identify themselves as being part of some formal religion. 73%. So that's 7 out of 10 people. That's an overwhelming majority, right? In fact, if you do the math, you'll find out that 67% of those folks put themselves in a pretty traditional Christian category. So 67 to 73% of the soldiers here identify themselves as having some religious background, some kind of connection to some faith community. So how do we use that How do we leverage that? How do we maximize and encourage that spiritual and religious activity so that we get the protective quality that we saw on the slides prior? So that's one of the great applications that we're looking at for this information, this study. When I was at the seminar, got put into a small group, and in my small group, we were talking about how we were going to share this material. What was it? What benefit is it? Is knowing all this data about spirituality and religious practice? And we started asking the question, and this is I'm going to admit, especially for all you any commanders that are out there listening, this is a gross simplification. But one of the things we came to is we began to say, well, what do commanders want? What do we as a post want? What do commanders want? And again, in a gross simplification, but I think most commanders would agree with me, they want good things to go up and they want bad things to go down. Good things up, bad things out, right? Better qualities of all the things that we think of as good. We want the blotter to go down, right? So that's a pretty motivating factor. Good things up, bad things down. So as we looked at that, we began to realize that again, this research, if we can apply it at the unit level, we're convinced that it'll make good things go up and it'll make bad things go down. And the science backs that up. The science shows that those protective qualities will kick in and it'll cause people to have more purpose, to be more motivated, to be involved in better behaviors, and that it will reduce the negative behaviors that so oftentimes land people on the blotter or in the commander's office or in jail. So that was kind of the takeaway for us was good things up, bad things down. The last one we came away with was wellness. And again, that's why we're in this lineup today talking about wellness, right? Every soldier every year has to take something called the GAT, the Global Assessment Tool. But what does the Global Assessment Tool look at? It looks at our mental, emotional, physical, social, and spiritual. Spiritual is part of that, right? That if we want to be well people, we have to be well-rounded. And whenever we think of well-rounded, we think of those categories. We think of our mental ability, we think of our emotional, we think of our social, our family, we think of our physical, are we getting enough exercise, are we sleeping, are we eating right? We think of, but we also shouldn't ignore the spiritual, because in some ways the spiritual brings some of the most protective qualities that we could possibly have. We are entering into a new phase here with some new emphasis on a program called H2F, Holistic Health and Fitness. Again, one of the 6 or 7 domains of the H2F program is spirituality, because we have this innate understanding that any person who wants to have a well-rounded and whole life needs to be involved in all of these, in building strength and resiliency in all of these different areas, and deriving the good benefit from each one of them. And so I guess my pitch to you today would be to invest in the spiritual. I think anecdotally, people would have said that for years, that, you know, if you invest in your spiritual and your religious life, it'll be good for you. But this is a second step, another step where we're not just saying that anecdotally. So the science is now telling us that this is one of the most protective things that you can do for yourself. Okay? All right, well, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. I don't see any questions. Let me click on my chat button just to make sure. Um, I don't see any questions in the chat area, but if anybody would like to raise a question, just push the little button that says hand raised, and I will I will call on you, and we can do it that way. So, any questions? I covered the material so thoroughly that you don't possibly have any questions that you can ask at this point. I see a couple of folks out there contemplating, got quizzical looks on their faces. Okay, let's see. Master Sergeant Helseth.
Good morning, Chaplain. Thank you for your time and appreciate the presentation today. I'm Master Sergeant Helseth with the Washington Air National Guard, and the First Sergeant with the 194th. My civilian career is actually as a college professor, and so my question comes from that angle as well as dealing with our young troops that are coming into the National Guard. In the video, Dr. Miller talked about how parents and grandparents play a key role in formation of spirituality. And I'm curious as if there's any talk about what happens to those young troops that all of a sudden see a shift in their own spiritual formation from what they grew up with, and there's something that's a bit of a dichotomy between what their parents and grandparents may believe and have raised them as versus what they're now experiencing and finding to be real in their lives, and what kind of issues may arise from that shift as they're entering into military service and still in that formation of spirituality. If there's been any science in that and any kind of like keys that we can take away to kind of help troops that are dealing with that.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. That is a little bit outside of the realm of what Dr. Miller specifically is looking at. But I will tell you that there was an interesting corollary in her research about what happens to people who the parent or the grandparent was active spiritually and then passed that down to the child. And that is what brought the 80% or protective quality to the child. Okay. She then kept following those same groups of mothers or fathers and children, and found that if there was a third generation that passed it down to a third generation, that if there was a third generation connection spiritually within a family structure, the protective quality went up to 90%. That child or grandchild was 90% less likely to become involved in risky behaviors if they had a parent and or a grandparent or a strong family member. If it was 3-generational, it went up to 90%. So that's not quite exactly the answer to what your question is. You're asking if there's that longevity in a family and then the person has a slight difference of opinion with their parent before them. I think what Dr. Miller would say is that, yes, that's going to cause a crisis of consciousness. In fact, what she calls this surge period between teenage years and young adulthood is the quest. People are questing for their they're on a quest to find their spiritual life. And I think what she would say to you is, now I'm going to speak for her, not for me. I think what she would say to you is that as long as that soldier, that person is still involved in the spiritual conversation, as long as they are still developing their spirituality, even if it's a break from traditional parent spirituality, that the protective qualities would still be there, because it's their practice of spirituality and religion that bring that into their life. Not the connection has a part to play with it, but it really is how they are living out their spiritual life that is going to be the connective tissue for them. So that, yes, I see that we see that as chaplains, probably 50% of what we spend our time doing, right? Talking to young soldiers who are away from home for the first time, and now they're trying to find their own way in the world. They want to hold on, but they're seeing some different things. So yes, but that also is a great plug for the role that leaders, not only chaplains, but leaders like yourself can play, right? Helping people, not helping soldiers walk through that is incredibly important. I think a lot of times our tendency is to, especially if we're not a chaplain, if we're just a senior leader, is to basically say one of two things. Hey, that's not an area I feel comfortable getting into, or go talk to the chaplain. Now, go talk to the chaplain, I'm always going to encourage that. But one of the other thing we would try to, if that person is on a quest and they're looking for spiritual help and guidance, encourage that. You may not have the answer for them, but don't discourage or ignore how important that is to them, and and even in our culture, even in our society today. You saw those statistics. 73% of our soldiers are religious. So if as commanders and senior leaders and chaplains, if we're ignoring that, that's kind of criminal. 75 out of 100 of the people standing in front of you practice or say they practice some type of, and you if you're ignoring that's kind of an interesting dynamic. Why would you ignore that? If the overwhelming majority of your people are looking for or involved in or want some help with that, you should probably make that available to them, or build some kind of thing in your system that can do that. So hope that was somewhat helpful. Any other questions out there? We got about 1 more minute left, so we got plenty of time for one more question. All right, I'm going to close our timeout together so that you can get to other classes if you've signed up for them in the wellness symposium. You'll notice at the bottom of the slide, I don't know how if you're able to capture that, but I gave you some. I didn't want to deluge the screen with a truckload of all the research, but I tried to give you Dr. Miller's book, and then the second one is the article that's about the thickening cortex in the depression, and then 3 YouTube things that you can click on and just watch more of Dr. Miller's speeches or lectures on TED Talks, and one that she gave. The top one there is the conference that I actually attended. So you can click on that, or a portion of that conference. You can click on that and watch that. Hey, God bless you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful to you. And again, 1 through 3 June, if you're interested in this topic, we will be hosting Dr. Miller here for a seminar in June. Have a good day.